The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. Known as the Rainbow Nation, South Africa is blessed with flora, fauna, and diamonds. The idyllic city of Cape Town features the natural beauty of the Indo-Atlantic waters, the Table Mountains, and the Cape of Good Hope. This is all juxtaposed with South Africa's history of oppression and violence, stemming from years of racial inequality and income disparity. This was under a system called apartheid, from the Afrikaans word meaning separateness. During this time, the white minority of the country held a dominant sway over public life and political positions, making the indigenous Africans and members of the Indian diaspora second-class citizens in their own land. This oppressive system came to an end with the leadership of Nelson Mandela, who became the country's first black president in the post-apartheid generation. While the shackles of apartheid have come off and some wounds have healed, the scars still remain. Naidoo is an Indian-born South African social activist. He is the founding General Secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions and was a minister who served in President Mandela's cabinet. The Global Detail spoke to Mr. Naidoo to understand the state of the country, its economic prospects, and the future of Mandela's African National Congress.
I think most people would think about South Africa, and for them, Mandela epitomizes South Africa, and South Africa epitomizes Mandela. You've had a very close working relationship with Mandela. Tell us about, we know about Madiba, the political figure, but tell us about Madiba, the man, or more importantly, how Mandela became Madiba.
Well, I think that's a fascinating question because, we all remember Mandela as the most famous, prisoner of conscience of the 20th century. We remember him as a statesman, as the first president of the democratic South Africa. And we know him as a great leader for human rights and social justice. But actually, Mandela, the person, underwent a tremendous transformation when he entered Robben Island, the prison, where he spent his first 18 years in a jail cell, not bigger than your average small bathroom, and usually sleeping on a sisal mat most of that time. And so I think it's there that he understood the critical questions of our human experience, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? What defines the meaning of my humanity? And particularly, what am I here for? And so that transformation took place in those first 18 years. And I think it created a different type of Mandela who went from what he said to me, from the cesspool of the mind, with its attachments, with its cravings, with its ego, with its desires, to the seat of the soul, which is your heart, and he found there the connectedness that he had with everything that exists, not just human beings, whether it's animals, whether it's forest, whether it's the rivers or the oceans. And I think he evolved to a higher level of consciousness. And that's the Mandela the world interacts with when he leaves the jail. And I think these first comments when he leaves the jail, when he's asked a question by one of the journalists, Mr. Mandela, do you have revenge in your heart? Because they've taken away 27 years of your life in which you missed the interaction with your family, the deaths and births in much of the extended family, and you were isolated from the people and the struggle you had pursued and led. And he said very eloquently, if I leave this jail with bitterness and anger in my heart, I would still be in prison. And I think that captures Mandela and, his first speech in Cape Town. In fact, I was one of the first people to arrive at his prison cell. He was being housed in a separate building and a separate home. And, he welcomes us into the house. And, it's very early in the morning. It's the sun's just rising. It's chilly. We arrive there, a warrant officer opens the door and he walks out, and here's the person that's been the center of your life and struggles for much of your adult life. And you are intimidated by the fact that it is a Mandela. And he walks out and says, "Hello, my comrades. Welcome to my home at the moment." And he then takes us around his house, shows us where the hidden microphones are. And then I see that he's using the smallest room in that house on the prison grounds. And I understood that once, if you've lived 27 years of your life in a particular way, in a structured, rigid way, it's very difficult to change old habits. So he had chosen the smallest room in that house. And so when he leaves there, and we're having a tremendous debate, and the world is waiting for Mandela to walk out of the prison gates of Victor Verster, and we are taking hours. And the debate is about where should Mandela speak first. And so as people flooded in from the reception committee and the family, there was quite a strident debate about should he not speak in Soweto, which is like the crucible of our struggle against apartheid. And he listens very quietly for hours, making sure we all serve tea, we all have biscuits, and then he speaks very softly to say, "I have heard all of you, but this has been my home for 27 years, and this is where I will speak." And if I take one element of what he said when he addressed the thousands of people on that fateful day when he walked out of prison, he said, "I stand before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant that has been freed by the energies and the struggles of you, the people." This is the example of what made Mandela so different to the political leadership we had at the time, and particularly the political leadership we have today. Because I cannot see, when I look up at the global stage across every sector, business, politics, social justice, human rights, trade unions, I do not see anyone that represents the values that Mandela stands for. The idea that I'm here to serve my people, I'm here to serve my country, I'm here to serve my continent, I'm here to understand I am part of nature, not apart from nature. And that's what differentiates a Mandela from the political leadership that we have today that have completely lost the plot.
Jay, thank you so much for taking us back down memory lane. Those are very profound. Just trying to imagine those scenes. And you've unpacked a lot, and I want to get into all of that. But long before Mandela, apartheid existed long before Mandela. In fact, in some ways, apartheid gave rise to Mandela, where he rose like a phoenix from the ashes. I wanted to ask your own brush with apartheid. You mentioned in an interview that you were 4 years old when you were confronted with this harsh reality. Most people at 4 years old don't even know their own name, but they're still very profoundly impacted. And children are more precocious than we give credit for. And you mentioned about a time when you're 4 years old and you're evicted from your own house just simply because you are the wrong color on the wrong side of the street. And a lot of people may relate to it by reading Madiba's Long Walk to Freedom, Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. But what was your own story when you're 4 years old, seeing your parents and yourself being evicted, and you couldn't understand what was going on, but yet you could understand something was wrong at the same time?
Oh, absolutely. The fact of the matter is that my I am a descendant of my great-grandmother who came from the south of India to work on the sugar farms as an indentured laborer. Well, that's a term that is more sophisticated, but it means a slave. And so I am the fourth generation from her. And I consider myself an African. In fact, Kwame Nkrumah, one of our great liberation heroes in our struggle against colonization from Ghana, once said, to be African is not just being born in Africa, but that Africa is born in you. And so, yes, I when I was 4 years old, living in Durban, the port city where my great-grandmother landed and worked on the sugar farms, I was 4 years old, and we were very comfortable and a very beautiful community surrounded by fruit trees and particularly mangoes that I loved climbing. And I had a community. And then suddenly one day we forced to leave. And my parents never explained that at 4 years old. But I was incredibly angry about leaving this place that I loved and the friends that I had there. And so I understood later that it was the Group Areas Act. It was a social engineering experiment where the apartheid state wanted to remove what they call black spots. So we happened to be a black spot. We were the wrong color on the wrong side of the street. So we had to be moved. 3 million people were moved in South Africa. That means 3 million families were disrupted, families that were black. And so, yes, it was incredibly disruptive. And it's hard to understand what institutionalized racism is. Racism is very much a reality of our world. We all understand that. Just walk through customs in the West, and you'll understand if you're a person of color and your name doesn't accord to that of a Western name, and then suddenly you are profiled. We all understand the meaning of profiling, although the system denies that they do profile. And so we were prevented from many things. We had to go to separate schools. We had to live in separate areas. You couldn't get on white buses. You couldn't, as a descendant of a grandmother that came from India. I mean, I wasn't even allowed to go into the Indian Ocean. There were certain areas that were restricted from any black person going onto the beach. So this is how deep it was. It ran deeply. And of course, you start to believe after a while that maybe there's something wrong with you. And you get really angry about it. Maybe it's right that I am excluded because of the color of my skin. You start to believe that you are inferior. This is about becoming a person that has an inferior complex. And so, yes, we struggle with that even today, because racism is a reality. Discrimination on the basis of many things is a reality. And so, yes, I felt then that I really was angry with myself and my parents. And then at 15, I go to a meeting because I'm the youngest of 7 children. And my elder brother, 2 years ahead of me, is in training college, and he had been exposed to an incredibly charismatic student leader called Steve Biko. Steve Biko brought us the notion to be black and to be proud. And his words ring in my ears as if it was yesterday. At this crowded church hall, surrounded by an intimidating presence of security forces. And there he comes on stage and he says, "We have nothing to lose but our chains, because the mind of the oppressed is the main weapon in the hands of the oppressor." Very much, again, the reality of today in the context of many challenges we face, where the status quo tries to argue that it wants to think for us. And so Steve Biko was the most important political influence in my life. And thank God he did not have a business plan or a PowerPoint presentation or even money, because that would have diluted the potential of the revolution. But he influenced millions of us. And it came out of an enormous ferment globally. In the late 60s, there was an explosion of students rebelling against the status quo. There was the growth of the peace movements and the anti-Vietnam protests in the US. There was the explosion of the Black Panther movement, the militant, determined effort by Afro-Americans like, Malcolm X or, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. So the world was in ferment. And out of that, we caught the tail end of that, and it exploded into a movement. And in 1976, we rose in our millions to protest against the imposition of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in our schools. And the state smashed us. They killed hundreds of young people in our schools, in our townships. There are thousands that left into exile. Many of us went into hiding. And so, rising out of that, we created a generation of what we call permanent revolutionaries who would spend their lives committed to fighting apartheid. We were a generation prepared to die for our freedom, and many did die.
Well, I just remember that was such a seminal. I mean, it was long before my time, but it was a very seminal moment in the world. As you mentioned, the Vietnam War, MLK's "I Have a Dream." The Steve Biko was such an influential and charismatic figure. And his death, his brutal death, being beaten by the state and state machinery, perhaps that galvanized the world to the injustices and atrocities of what was going on in South Africa under the Afrikaner government. And I want to get to some of the cultural elements coming out at that time, but I remember watching The Color of Friendship, and it was almost very insidious of how fascist regimes in Europe tried to portray a narrative, where you tried to portray Steve Biko, as they did with Mandela, as just as a terrorist, as someone who was a troublemaker, and the state was righteous, and hiding literature that spoke about the oppressed. And I think Steve Biko's death, as sad as it was, also lit the global awareness of the injustices going on in South Africa. Did you see that spark that not just happened in South Africa, but went all across the Atlantic to the West and across other parts of the world, that people looked and shone their spotlight on South Africa, and they were like, something had to change at this point?
Absolutely. I mean, Steve Biko's death was brutal because in 1977, he was already under house arrest, monitored daily by the security police. And then he gets arrested, beaten and tortured in prison in Port Elizabeth. And then he falls unconscious because of the beatings. They throw him into the back of a police van, and they drive him 1,000 kilometers to Pretoria to get medical attention, and he dies. Of course, he was the spark that lit a bushfire across not just South African youth, but across the world. He ignited something about the brutality of apartheid at a time when many of the most powerful nations in the West, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, were fully backing the apartheid regime because they saw the apartheid regime as a bulwark against the threat of global communism and the Soviet Union. So again, you see the repetition of events even today. The imperial powers always need to have a scapegoat. They always need to have an enemy that they are fighting. And unfortunately, people in Africa or Asia or South America, the developing world, we always get caught in the crossfire between global powers in a geopolitical conflict. This is what is happening today. They're trying to draw us into a battle that essentially is between, Russia and NATO and the United States, and actually has very little to do even with Ukraine people. Unfortunately, they are caught in the crossfire as we are caught in the crossfire of this global competitiveness that is seeing the rise of a new arms race, a new Cold War, a conventional wars that litter our world, and even the threat of a nuclear war. We are living in extremely dangerous times.
dangerous times indeed. And going back to the dangerous times, in '77 with Biko's death, you also become active with the South African Students Organization, and your own awakening, your own consciousness comes to the forefront. And then, of course, you also you took control of South Africa's largest trade union. It's funny at a time because trade unions are about promoting business and trade, but uh, was that a time where you could look at the political struggle in South Africa and see all the repression going on and still have optimism in the trade unions being able to come about and galvanize change? What was the post Biko era like for you when you, after Biko's death, you want to make sure it wasn't in vain, and for young leaders like yourself rising through the forefront?
Well, when Biko was murdered, I knew that I'd spend the rest of my life fighting for freedom. We were a generation prepared to die for freedom of our people. And so after a period of hiding from the security police, I entered a fledgling union movement because it was it was illegal for African workers to join registered trade unions that could be recognized by employers until late 1979. And even when the apartheid state, under pressure, was forced to amend its laws to allow the registration of African workers, they tried to exclude the majority by saying anyone who's not a migrant worker will be excluded from the trade union movement or from joining a recognized trade union. And that would have excluded 85% of African workers because we were all temporary work in the white cities. So we fought that, and eventually we won that fight, and then we built up a powerful movement. And trade union movement in South Africa was different because it was a form of political unionism. People had very few avenues to take up their grievances, and so through the trade union movement, which is primarily a focus on collective bargaining, improving conditions of employment, wages, working conditions, etc., but it also had political aspirations because workers have political aspirations. You couldn't have freedom and rights in a factory. When you walk out of the factory gate, there's a policeman demanding that you produce a dom pass. A dom pass was a document that you had that proved that you had the right to stay in a city, in a white city. It was a form of identification. And if you didn't have it, you were arrested and sent to jail. And most of the people that were arrested for past offenses were used as labor on the farms of white farmers. So it was a form of forced labor. So here we have a situation where I'm entering that and I become a union organizer. And it's a time when even the union movement, that fledgling union movement, is under attack from employers and the apartheid state, and from elements that are associated with the apartheid state, that are the covert forces of the apartheid state. That means they are assassins and hit squads. And so I happened to be on a number of death lists as well. And then there was the apartheid state using either its own its own tools, its own puppets that it had employed, or using the security forces itself to try and control and create a situation of fear. And fear is a very powerful tool of fascist regimes. And so if one looks again at the way in which the pandemic was handled, it was based on fear, guilt, and shame. These are tactics of really totalitarianism. Create a threat of victimization or fear of even death, and get people to comply with what you want. And so we fought all of that, and the union movement emerged to become the most powerful organization in South Africa in the fight against apartheid. And so, of course, workers who had joined them in the millions now suddenly had a home on which to face the apartheid state. And they bombed many of our offices. They detained thousands of our leaders. There are a number of trade union leaders that were murdered. And even our headquarters was bombed by the apartheid state in 1987. But we knew that we will win. The question is at what cost? But by the late 80s, we had paralyzed the apartheid state. And in 89, and some major international events happened, like the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which suddenly removed the threat of global communism and created a unipolar world dominated by the United States. So these governments, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, saw the increasing militancy of the trade union movement and of the democratic movement, and understood that change was coming, and therefore put pressure on the apartheid state to enter into negotiations. Because the stalemate had been reached. They could not eliminate us, and they were too powerful a state with too much international backing for us to say that we could take them out in a battle. So we were in a state of a low-scale civil war that was rapidly escalating. And in fact, the entire world believed that we were entering a period of a racial civil war that would kill many people and destroy much of the infrastructure. We see this in many parts of the world, including in Africa, whether that's South Sudan or North Sudan, or whether that's DRC or the Sahel region. And so, fortunately, we had the depth of leadership on our side. And it was Mandela that initiated contact with the apartheid state. But remember, for the entire decade up to now, we had been involved in negotiations with the biggest ally of the apartheid state, which was the employers. And though we were militant, they understood that we were legitimate trade unionists. And once they had an agreement with us, it was a binding agreement. So they understood that we would have rights as workers, as Black people. They understood the need for transition, and they saw an aggravating conflict that was escalating into a racial civil war. So we were able to strip apart from the apartheid state many of their most important partners, including in the police and security forces. And so that created the enabling environment within which leaders could emerge on both sides, rise above their constituencies, and rather than contest their divergent views, find the common ground. And ultimately, the common ground was found, even though the National Party, the party that put Mandela in jail, wanted a veto for white people on any democratic dispensation. We were able to convince them that ultimately real democracy is based on one person, one vote in a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist state. So they accepted that after a tremendous, again, loss of life and conflicts that took place. But ultimately, the solution to South Africa's challenges and the transitional path towards democracy was determined by South Africans, not by anyone else.
You unpack so much with that, and as much as I want to just quickly go to Mandela, it'd be remiss if I didn't visit the past, because I mentioned I'm such a South Africa aficionado. I can somehow I sang Nico Sicily Africa, and it's such a confluence of language with Xhosa, Zulu, Sesotho, Afrikaans, English. And you mentioned about your own heritage as Indian, and people forget we celebrate a little over 150 years of Indian indentured labor, and that happened because of when African slavery was banned. The British colonies shipped people from India to Africa, to the Caribbean islands, to Fiji. South Africa is a confluence of all these races. The Dutch came to Cape Town, Cape of Good Hope. The British came. You had the Boer and the Anglo-Boer wars. You had the Indian influence. You had the indigenous African influences. All these communities are part of the Rainbow Nation, and yet, if you just trace back, because if you were to play South African historian here, there's so much angst even between the Boers and the Anglos. Um, where do you think uh, this sense of white superiority, the sense of dominance came from the Afrikaner regime? Was it just the scars of the Anglo uh, losing out against the British? And to the point that how do you think it shaped your identity as a as a South African of Indian heritage, given Durban is such a very indigenous part of that, and people forget things like Bunny Chow came because I think the Indian immigrants were not given plates, and the bread became a way to contain the curry, and that is just a fascinating story. There's so many historical elements of South Africa. It's not just black and white. There's so many other stories that come together, and I suppose my question is, if you were to play South African historian, how would you first unpack both in the Indianness and being in South Africa, and as well as the Afrikaner sense of superiority that came about and that led to the suppression?
Well, again, a fascinating question, because I think we've got to understand the roots of racism, which actually emerged in the period of the European Renaissance, when Europe, was transitioning out of feudalism towards a type of mercantile capitalism. And what they needed was raw materials, and what they needed was markets for their finished products. So the basis of colonization and slavery was to create an understanding that people that lived in these countries that were to be colonized, Africa, Asia, and America, were inferior, were in many cases not human, were described as savages, ignorant. And so you could create a strategy, a campaign of occupation on the basis that you are going out there to civilize people who actually were barely human. So the entire narrative of racism emerged at the time of European Renaissance as an underpin to the economic system that we currently have today of capitalism. It had to justify what they did: the plundering, the looting, the rape, the torture, the genocide. We had to have a justification for that. And they used even the Bible to justify why they did that. And this is what the situation in South Africa was. They had to justify that we were not equal to them, even though the science is telling us that 99%, we are 99% identical, and the handful of the genes that determine our different physical characteristics are all about an adaptation to climate rather than any scientific basis to race. There's only one human race. So racism is a social construct that's very real in the life of people of color, or happen to be from a different culture to that of the West itself. And we experience this every day, and every time you walk through an airport. You're made to feel like a foreigner. And even though they say you're not profiled, it's remarkable that 75% of people that are pulled out of line coming through the Western country happen to be people of color. So racism exists. Now, South Africa was part of that. And so what's interesting about South Africa is that the original inhabitants are the Khoi and the San. These are our oldest living ancestors. And they are, in fact, the people that create the basis of language, of music, of understanding commerce. And eventually, Africa is the cradle of all humanity. So ultimately, every citizen of this world is an African at the root of it. And so Africa's role has shaped much of the world today. And one finds that, whether that's agriculture, commerce, civilization. I mean, we were talking about kingdoms of the Benin, of Makumbubwe, of the Egypt 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, when there was no civilization in Europe. So here we have a situation where South Africa became a melting pot of where North meets South, East meets West. And so, yes, we are the classic example of how to manage transition and manage diversity. And that's why South Africa's constitution, its constitutional democracy, embraces that. And that was the arc of the contribution that the Mandela generation made for us. It gave us a constitutional democracy within which we're able to address the legacy of apartheid. And it also gave us our hands on the levers of power to be able to shape that democracy. And the idea was that we should celebrate diversity. So South Africa is not a Christian country or a country that is, bound to one religion. All religions are recognized. All faiths are recognized, even though the majority of people are Christian. There's an appreciation of indigenous belief systems in South Africa. The concept of Ubuntu that comes out of Africa is a concept about I am because we are. And while it's been bastardized by a Western interpretation, it doesn't just talk about us as human beings. When in the indigenous way in Africa, you look at a forest, you look at the spirit of the forest, not timber to be sold to make yourself money. When you look at the ocean or the land or the plants or the wild animals, these are all seen as an extension of yourself. So Africans very much look at environment as we are part of the environment rather than apart from her. So in an indigenous way, before the shadow of the last 500 years of colonization and slavery, African people saw themselves as part of nature, just like people in Asia saw themselves as part of nature. And so they would not destroy nature like we do today. They would not throw poisons into a river or slaughter our forests. So these are the issues that I think Africa has tremendous knowledge on, and to remind us of where we come from, that our journey of the last 200,000 years that took us from Africa to the rest of the world had imbibed and created a set of principles: reciprocity, fairness, compassion, an understanding of interconnection between me and everything else that exists on our planet Earth, an understanding that I am more than this mind or this body or this intellect of mine, that ultimately the meaning of life is, one, to become a good ancestor, but secondly, to transcend the limitations of this body and mind, to become supramental, to understand that we have the potential for a much higher level of consciousness, where we perform our role as a custodian of this planet rather than seeking to dominate this planet. And in the domination of this planet, we believe that we are the top of the feeding chain. Just look at Akshobh, how much we have destroyed. 80% of wild animals have been destroyed. 60% of the topsoil of our world has been destroyed. If we're not able to produce food that is healthy, that produces better health, that comes from soil that is healthy, then we're not going to have healthy human beings. We are not going to have a healthy environment. So I think it's about returning to what we were and how we understood ourselves. That was the journey of a Mandela, to remind us that we are custodians, to remind us that, in fact, the pillars of democracy, of civilization, is empathy, is compassion, is solidarity. These are the values we need today, not the values of material accumulation, to stand on the heads of others, to engage in acts of war or violence against children or women. This is the leadership we need today. And this is the leadership that is sadly lacking when I look up. When I look down in the trenches, in the townships, in the rural areas, I find thousands of people doing work that is noble, that is advancing the rights of nature, that's advancing the rights of children of different cultures, that's understanding the beauty of diversification, of diverse diets to diverse cultures, diverse languages. I think we have a potential that we thought we would achieve in this, 23rd century that would take us to a new level of consciousness. Yet what I find is that we're spiraling downwards towards our animal instincts, which is, fight or flight. And I think that's our challenge today, a generational challenge and a civilizational challenge, that we do not recognize our full potential of a
Uh,
higher consciousness that we have.
yeah, I wanted to take you about what your message for posterity is, but uh, as someone who's really fascinated with South Africa and just the Indian identity, I wanted to ask you about Durban being the center of, in the Indian movement in South Africa, and I wanted to also peg this with, if I had to pick India and South Africa connection, of course the cricket cup is called the Gandhi Mandela Gandhi Trophy rather, and Mahatma Gandhi's identity came to the forefront in South Africa. In a lot of ways, to use a facetious term, I would say he became the reverse Anakin Skywalker, where he took off his suit and became the good person when he had the racist incident from being overthrown from the train compartment, a whites only compartment in Pietermaritzburg, if I'm not mistaken. And I think and Tolstoy farm played a very central role. So Gandhi's identity became central in South Africa. I'm cognizant that, of course, there is a part of Gandhi's story that doesn't sit well with a lot of indigenous Africans, and would like to touch on that. But also want to touch on the Indian identity in South Africa as well, just because, as you said, Indian indentured labor was brought here. The story of the past was not so pleasant, but it became very much part of the African continent as well. And Durban is very fascinating. It doesn't get mentioned outside in the international community to people not familiar, but just the very center of Durban, the identity of Durban is known for indigenous Indians, the Indians who were brought in, I guess, 1857, perhaps as long ago. So, walk me through history that at that time.
Yes, I think that Durban is very much very much diverse, with a large concentration of Indians. In fact, the largest Indian population outside of India is South Africa. There are more than 1 million Indians here now. And so they've played a very important role. They were able to retain their culture and their cuisine. But of course, in the course of them achieving a pathway of hope and opportunity in their own lives, they invested a tremendous amount in education. They built schools, educated their children, and I was a beneficiary of that. I learned I learned English, because that was the language of the oppressor where I was born, and so that and I sometimes feel that I would have loved to learn Tamil, but we had to understand in the context where your only hope is to get a job or to get income was learning the language of the oppressor. That became the priority. In the course of that, you lost the indigenous languages. And this has happened not just in South Africa or to the Indian diaspora in South Africa, but this has happened to many indigenous cultures across the world. Many have become invisible. Many have become extinct. And that's a tragedy for the world, that we're becoming dominated by the powerful languages of the colonizers. So even our interview is in English. But you come from India, and my ancestry came from India, So if you look at the domination that took place, that created these racial stereotypes, language and culture was a very important part of that. Now, the majority of Indians came as laborers, but alongside them came traders who saw an opportunity, because in the 1860s, 150,000 indentured laborers arrived here in South Africa. So alongside them came traders from the north of India, while the indentured laborers were mainly from the south of India, to be able to trade on goods that this Indian indentured labor would like and would appreciate. And so these traders were so successful in competing with white traders that the white traders were able to lobby their colonial authorities to put restrictions on them. And these restrictions prevented them from trading in many places and putting taxes on them, etc. So Gandhi came as an English-trained lawyer to represent traders. And when he arrived in Durban, he got on the train and bought a first-class ticket. And as he sat in the first-class coach, when it arrived to the next city after Durban, he was asked by the conductor, "What are you doing in this compartment? You're not allowed to be here." And Gandhi produces his first-class ticket and insists in his proper, English accent that he has got a ticket, and is grabbed by the scruff of his neck and thrown off the train. That was the initial transformation that made Gandhi question who he was. And so often we say, India sent us Gandhi, we sent you back the Mahatma. So Gandhi's experience of the passive resistance campaign in South Africa shaped his future destiny as the father of India's liberation struggle. And I think it was, and he influenced many leaders, including the Mandelas and many leaders across Africa and the world. If you look at the third pillar of those 20th century iconic figures of human rights and social justice, Martin Luther King, as well, saw Gandhi as a saint, as a person who shaped a moral responsibility for us as human beings to establish a flow of rights for all people, irrespective of their race or the color or the religion or their creed. So Gandhi played a very important role. Obviously, we have to look at context. This is now happening, almost 150 to 170 years ago, So we are looking at a situation where the context matters. And there's a battle between the English and the Afrikaners in South Africa, and Gandhi feels compelled to provide health services. And in the course of it, he sees such brutality that it shapes his own opinions about the course of struggle. And that's why it develops Satyagraha, the non-violent passive resistance, as an alternative to war. Did Gandhi make mistakes? Absolutely. Some of his comments, when taken out of context, will be seen as almost racist today. But so was he in India when he talked about the Dalits, and the untouchables. Not everyone agrees, especially Dr. Ambedkar and the Dalit leadership did not agree with Gandhi on how discrimination was being entrenched in India through the caste system that marginalized 200 million people that are of Dalit origins. So yes, like Mandela always said, "I've made many mistakes in life. I'm not a saint." So did Martin Luther King. These were extraordinary human beings, but they were human beings, and human beings make mistakes. So when we are judging them, judge them in the context where they were, and judge them across the arc of their life. There are people today, especially young people, that say Mandela sold us out. Now, if you're taking the situation and going back to the context of 1990, when we're in a state of a racial civil war, there are hundreds of people being killed, every day, and you are rapidly escalating into a full-scale war, and you have to rise above your constituencies and swim against the current. Of course, we made mistakes. But at the end of the day, across the arc of his life, what he stood for was the rights of our people, the human rights, the dignity, and the social rights of our people. And so did Mandela, Gandhi, so did Martin Luther King. So I think we have to judge these historic, iconic personalities in the context of the environment in which they lived. All of them were criticized for not
Three
being
phenom.
militant enough. But if you look at their role as
Mhm.
iconic leaders, they achieved what they wanted. If you look at Mandela, he achieved one person, one vote in a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. That was the mandate of his generation. If you look at a Gandhi, he played a sterling role in delivering the independence of India. If you look at Martin Luther King and the role of the civil rights movement, he delivered through the White House and through his interactions and through the streets, he delivered the goal that Black people have the right to vote today in the United States. But they were all human beings, extraordinary human beings, but human beings.
Absolutely. They can be both profound as well as fallacies can happen. And three phenomenal M's, Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and the juxtaposition between someone like Mandela and someone like Mugabe is well evinced here, because Mandela chose compassion, chose forgiveness, and Mugabe chose retribution. And I think that's two leaders who both saw oppression, suffering, saw white colonial hubris, but that just shows character in some ways. The story of Zimbabwe went away, and perhaps some would argue the story of South Africa is far from Mandela's South Africa. But if you just were to juxtapose Mandela's character was Mugabe, but Mandela, as I remember in our previous conversation, even had tea, I think, with the widow of Heinrich Verwoerd, the very architect of apartheid, the very who created the system of oppression that was supposed to break Modiba, but he rose above it. He chose to have a united South Africa, not a South Africa of just black people or people of color, but of one for all South Africa, where Africana is still very much part of the South African anthem, the South African identity, even though it was a regime that only believed in Africana above everyone else at that time.
You know, Mandela made some very extraordinary choices in life. And like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, chose a path of peaceful resistance. And in the height of the challenges we experienced when he was released, because there were many people that were angry on the side of the apartheid state and his allies, that President de Klerk, the last president of the apartheid state, had unbanned the ANC, which Mandela led, and all other banned political organizations, and started the process of releasing political prisoners. So there was deep anger, and that's what caused a lot of the conflict that emerged when Mandela is released. Because while the majority of South Africans, both black and white, welcomed it, there was a powerful minority that were fully armed, that were prepared to organize and orchestrate an insurrection. And Mandela extraordinarily were able to talk to, especially the leaders of the South African Defence Force, and draw them into the democratic process. So he had this extraordinary way of bringing people into the democratic process. And so Mandela always sought to be inclusive. The difference with Zimbabwe, and one has to unpack it in a much deeper way, because often one can point a finger at the Mugabes, and he was responsible for some reprehensible deeds. A repression against activists, the way in which he dominated the political scene, and ultimately the way in which ZANU-PF became, in fact, identified with the state, and therefore became the main beneficiary of the peace process. That and this is typical of many liberation movements, including South Africa, where a liberation movement which led the fight for freedom ends up eating the children of the revolution, because the leadership of the movement post Mandela started to believe that they had some divine right to rule our country. And this is what we see in the world today. Our political leadership, I'm not just talking about governments, I'm talking about the UN system, I'm talking about the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank and the EU. They believe that they have some sort of divine right to rule us, to determine what our freedom means, to make decisions like we saw in the last three years of the pandemic response, which closes millions of businesses, that destroys millions of jobs, and that almost wants to take over our control and sovereignty over our countries and even our bodies. So we're at a point where the political leadership has been so compromised in the world that they are just marionettes dangling at the orders of people that are the vested interests that control the world today. And let's look at it. In the last 3 years, the 1%, the billionaire class, made trillions of dollars when hundreds of millions of people were thrown into poverty. So one has to understand that we need a new category of leaders today, and leaders that are conscious about what their responsibility is, the role of servant leadership, the role of people organizing themselves to hold accountable those in power. The corporatized media has died, has killed journalism, investigative journalism. That's why people are looking at podcasts like this to get their information. They no longer can rely on mainstream media because all of them articulate an official narrative that supports an agenda of a 1% in the world. And so people are desperately looking for other sources of information, and increasingly alternative media is emerging. And the internet now has created a level playing field through which we are able to express ourselves, even though the big tech is trying to almost edit what we are saying, trying to control and censor what we are saying and what we are believing. I think more and more people, particularly young people, are saying, we do not trust anyone in an institution, whether that's a newspaper, whether it's a TV station, whether it's our government or business CEO or the World Economic Forum. We cannot trust these people. So what we're facing today is a huge gulf of mistrust between the majority of people and those that control the reins of power in our world. And I think today we are, the question I spend a lot, I ask of many young people who I spend most of my time with, because I find it completely useless trying to have conversations about these issues with people of my generation. They're so all co-opted by the power and the strings and the accessories of power that they've forgotten why they are leaders. And so young people today, the question I ask them is, we were a generation prepared to die for freedom. What are you prepared to live for today? And most times it evokes an incredibly rich and diverse conversation about what young people want. And a lot of young people don't want to have a BMW and the latest iPhone. They are concerned about the challenges, about the generations still to come, when we are standing at the edge of an ecological crisis, where we are seeing rising inequality in the world, rising poverty and hunger in the world. They are concerned about what world will they be bringing children into. And I have faced that even with my own children, who feel that very reluctant to bring children into the world that we have today. And if our children are saying that to us, that they are scared to have children because they cannot trust us, then the question we have to ask ourselves, what is the debate we should have about what civilization means? What does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to have our basic needs met? And how do I work as part of nature rather than apart from nature? I cannot assassinate the birthright of generations still to be born. And I'm reminded of a Native American proverb which says, we do not inherit our planet from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I hope that we can instill through conversations like this an attitude amongst young people where they find their voice, they find their destiny, they find their agency, and they find their struggles. And they are courageous to stand up and face those that want to take their rights away, that abuse power. That's my mantra that I get up with every morning, because I have 3 grandsons now. And I know many other young people that are having children today that are looking for leadership that is moral, leadership that's ethical, leadership that is courageous. And that's what's missing today in our trade unions, in our civil society, in our United Nations, but doesn't exist in business or in government today.
You spoke about privilege, and I remember Cecil Rhodes, of course, whom erstwhile Zimbabwe Rhodesia named after the Cape, was a British imperialist, and he says to be born British is to come first in the lottery of life. I mean, that hubris. And two people who also played a very instrumental part, if you think about South Africa and breaking the shackles of apartheid, you have to say, and the post-it, two seminal figures would have to be de Klerk as well as Desmond Tutu, and you also played a big part in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I remember, if I recall correctly, Desmond Tutu said when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible, we had the land. They asked us to pray, and when we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. Was it possible that Mandela could not have achieved post-apartheid without de Klerk, without someone from the oppressor race helping, and just the role that de Klerk played and the role that Tutu had in the influence of South Africa? If you can touch on these two very influential figures, de Klerk and Desmond Tutu.
The 3 of them received the Nobel Prize for peace. And yes, de Klerk was hawk, in fact. He was a conservative. But he had the intellect to understand that it was the end of the road for apartheid. And then the courage to articulate that publicly and take a decision. Obviously, under a lot of pressure from his Western allies, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom. So, yes, de Klerk made the decision. It took him a long time before he was able to apologize for apartheid. And throughout his life, he thought he had liberated Mandela, when in fact, it was the millions of people who stood up and said, we refuse to collaborate with apartheid and with your oppressive system of governance. So he was compelled by the struggles within our country, by the fact that there was pressure from international, that the sanctions campaign was biting deep into the economy.
Right.
And international solidarity had reached such a point that this was now a crime against humanity. It was a heresy. So faced with that situation, he had no choice. But of course, he had the courage to accept. And even in his dealings with Mandela in the earlier days, his view was, I want to have a veto right on any democratic dispensation until we compel the rest of the team with him that was impossible to achieve. And they accepted it. So yes, he played an important role, but must be seen in a context. Archbishop Tutu was an extraordinary leader. I mean, he was the heart of our struggle against apartheid, and he was absolutely honest with us, and sometimes very critical of things we did as part of the anti-apartheid forces. But we all respected him. Yeah. In fact, Archbishop Tutu once said, if it wasn't for the liberation songs and the liberation dances that we had and the way we organized and mobilized people, our struggle would have been a lot bloodier and would have taken a lot longer. So, of course, as a archbishop, as the primary spiritual leader of our country, Archbishop Tutu was nominated by Mandela to lead the process of reconciliation and truth. in chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which I think the biggest question we had was what would be the route we choose? Should we go down the Nuremberg route, which we put people on trial for crimes against humanity, which was a strong opinion that we should do that? Or should we go the reconciliation route, where we seek to get the truth, but try to build a process beyond revenge and punishment? And what we understood by reconciliation is it's not just an apology and articulating what happened in detail so that we understand, particularly when there are many parents that or loved ones that had disappeared, been buried in unknown graves, that had been murdered by their security forces, and people wanted closure on their losses. But the third element was what was important: reparations. That we would have to commit deeply to not just reparations in relation to the families that had lost loved ones, reparations in relation to a fact that apartheid had marginalized the vast majority of Black people, and therefore healing had to incorporate us leveling the playing field and ensuring that we address the legacy of apartheid, which meant not just the deracialization of apartheid, but the deracialization of our economy, and the fact that 87% of the land had been dispossessed of Black people. And therefore we had to have land reform. Now, we succeeded in the first instance in creating a constitutional democracy, which became a political miracle of transition. But we failed in deracializing our economy and in ensuring that people have access to land that they had been dispossessed of because of the color of their skin. So if you go back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think while we achieved the overall objective that we got the truth in most cases, and those people that confessed and had a political reason, whether acting under instruction of someone in government, the apartheid government, or acting with a political motive, they would get amnesty from an amnesty committee. And those that didn't come forward should then be brought before proper legal jurisprudence in the justice system. And so this process was unsatisfactory. And so we're still sitting with a number of cases that have not been resolved, where the perpetrators of human rights violations have not come forward to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had produced a report which said the following cases need to be followed up in the criminal justice system, and that has not happened sufficiently today. And where overall the vast bulk of Black people in our country still continue to live in conditions of marginalization, exclusion, and poverty. So we are a mixed bag. And the responsibility of that sits directly at the door of those that are now leading the organization that Mandela led, the African National Congress, which today is in charge of government in South Africa. So we have to hold them accountable and hold their feet to the fire and be banging on their doors. But this requires young people to organize themselves, to build a new movement that we need, that delivers the type of democracy that we had a dream of in 1994.
Yeah. Before I come back to South Africa, there's a very interesting part. I think you and I spoke a few years ago about the Bantu sons, and you and I have had the chance to visit Israel and Palestine, and seeing how some of the Palestinian settlements in the West Bank are almost a redolent of like the Bantu sons. And you, as someone, as a person of color growing up in South Africa, seen apartheid, witnessed apartheid in on all its atrocities. I'm cognizant of what your experience was when you saw the West Bank and Israel Palestine, and what lessons you could take away from the South African regime at that time. Is there a similarity, or is that a hyperbole?
Well, I haven't been to the West Bank and I haven't been to Israel. Something I would like to do, but I would like to be part of conversations between young people from Palestine and young people from Israel. I think that the South African experience has tremendous lessons for reconciliation in a conflict that goes back thousands of years in that area. The Palestinian issue has always been close to the heart of most South African activists. The struggle for self-determination in Palestine was similar to our struggle against apartheid. We were fighting for the right to self-determination, to have our rights as human beings accepted by our opponents. And I think that what's happened in Palestine and the West Bank has been a tragedy that's happened under our watch, a tragedy that continues to see young people slaughtered in Palestine. And so, yes, the identification of the majority of South Africans, Black South Africans, is with Palestinian cause. And I think the Palestinian youth have to organize themselves. And we face a similar challenge there that we face in South Africa, that the leadership we have can't be seen to be properly representing us in any negotiations with the enemy. So whether that's a one-party solution or whether it's a two-state solution is a choice of the people themselves. But to have a situation where an Israeli state continues to wage war on the West Bank against innocent people, women and children, and bulldoze homes is totally unacceptable and is comparable to what happened to us under apartheid. But we must make a distinction between the Israeli state and the Israeli people.
Absolutely.
And my hope is that Israeli youth, Jewish youth, will rise up and say, we want to build bridges with the Palestinian youth. In fact, I hope that their view will go further and say, we want to become the bridge between people who are Palestinian and people who are Israeli and Jewish.
Right.
And so my hope is that ultimately we see the oneness of everything that exists. I am you and you are me. That is the basis of our civilization, that accept your rights. I see you, I hear you, I experience you. I put myself in your shoes. Now, if there is the possibility of that type of work to be done, I am completely open to being part of that. I think there could be deep benefits out of the work that is done that brings people of different cultures, different traditions, different conflicts together to find the common ground. And I hope that work is done. And that work is not going to come from the top. It's going to come from the bottom.
It's also a valuable lesson that Mandela needed de Klerk, MLK needed LBJ for the Palestinians to achieve this. Israel has to have produced a de Klerk or LBJ, and that may not happen necessarily. But speaking of South Africa today, and I'm such a South Africa aficionado, and I remember asking this a few years ago, I came across documentaries on places like Orania and Kleinfontein, which are white Africana only enclaves, so people don't know, in Mandela, South Africa, where everyone's equal. And looking at what the residents of Orania and Kleinfontein, I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the relatives of Orania is a descendant of Werwood, and they mentioned that it's not a racist thing, but it's only to preserve Africana cultural elements, which seems a very roundabout way of saying unless you're only white Africana, then only you can live here. Is this very incongruous in Mandela's Rainbow Nation, that you have, a longing for the apartheid era South Africa, and it's metamorphosized in places like Orania and Kleinfontein?
Yes, I think that Mandela's attitude, Mandela actually went to go and have tea with the wife of Vervoet. Hendrik Vervoet was the architect of apartheid in the post 1948 government of South Africa. And yes, I think that it's a small community which wants to preserve itself. And as long as they understand that the overall constitution that governs the country, I would say let it happen. It's, we're not going, it doesn't get me up at night. And certainly it has no impact on the day-to-day lives of the 60 million South Africans. If that's what makes them happy, well, let them be happy in their isolation. And I think we have made a commitment to protect language and culture, all language and culture. So South Africa recognizes 11 official languages, including Afrikaans as a language. But you cannot legislate these things. I would like to see the preservation of Afrikaans. It's part of our history. It's what many people speak here. There's nothing to be ashamed of because it was used in a way that became a political tool of apartheid. It doesn't destroy the essence that it is a language and represents a culture. So I think we make too much of the differences between ourselves, of culture, sexual orientation, of language, of what nationality we are. I hope and pray that we come to a point where we understand that we are totally interconnected with everything that exists, not just on this planet, but entire cosmos. I mean,
Right.
how arrogant can we believe that when we look up the stars and see trillions of stars, that we are the only intelligent life?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's time for us to start to embrace the notion that our ignorance is much greater than our knowledge. And perhaps we should start to remember where we come from, understand why we are here, and what we do is both transitory and incomplete. We are work in progress as a human species. We are not fully evolved. We have the potential for an evolution beyond the supramental.
Yeah.
But we are not there. And so let's accept and celebrate this journey and understand that we can learn from each other.
Yeah.
That entire life is but a flow, a stream, a river of experiences. Some are joyful, some are painful, some are traumatic. Take the lesson of it. We are endowed with an intelligence that allows us free will and a polarity of choices. We can be loving, or we can be hateful or fearful. We can be tolerant, or we can be intolerant. This is a spectrum of choice we have with our free will. So when we do terrible things, what is the choice we are making? When we have leadership, does that leadership lead us into deeper divisions, deeper conflicts? That cannot be leadership. That's leadership that's retrograde. That leadership that one believes that represents the Mandelas or the Gandhis or the Martin Luther Kings of our world. So I think the critical question we have today is, what is the values we need? And I think those answers are not going to be found outside of us. As many of the wise sages have said to us, the journey out is the journey within. When you understand that this is the most important technology that exists, everything that is manifested out there,
Right.
including this equipment that we are using to communicate, started as an idea in this mind. It came from somewhere. And if we can understand that by creating a different set of ideas based on different set of values, then we can create heaven on earth. Heaven is not some other place. Heaven is here. And yes, we have to navigate this maze of emotions and psychology that catch us in the quicksand of our emotional and challenges that we have today as a society. But if we take a distance put a
Mm-hmm.
distance between ourselves and that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, life is a wonderful roller coaster of experiences where I learn lessons. We are coming down into this body, this human experience, to learn. It's like coming to school. And the lessons we learn graduate us to a higher and higher levels of consciousness. And if that is not happening in your religious organization or in your government and your trade union, in your NGO, in your business, then you're not doing the work. You're not finding the meaning of this particular life you're having in this particular human experience. And that's what the greatest sages from across the 200,000 years that we've evolved as a species called Homo sapiens, that's
Mm.
what they have tried to share with us. A lesson that we don't seem to be hearing or listening to or following.
You know, you said about heaven on earth, and most people would say that's something like Cape Town. Just the idyllic settings of the Table Mountain, the Cape of Good Hope, and the beautiful Indo-Atlantic spheres where they meet and the confluence of waters. But that's the juxtaposition where you have the beauty of Cape Town, and then you see the relics of the Cape Flats and social inequities and what apartheid's done, creating these fissures between the white enclaves, prosperous parts of South Africa, and some of where the Bantu sons were. And I suppose using that Cape Town analogy to a larger question, the rainbow nation where all the colors meet, and South Africa and colors are very it's a metaphor and literal at the same time. Wounds heal, but scars remain. Apartheid is no longer there, but the scars of that are still very much there, and you see it in the social inequalities. And you know how Cape Town, one of the most beautiful towns, is also one of the most unsafe places.
Yes, beauty under, covers a lot of deep distress in our society. The beauty we see is the beauty of the geography of the place. But what have you done with the geography? Even in those deeply depressed areas of the Cape Flats and the big informal townships in Cape Town, one sees inequality. It's in your face, like it is in India. And so, yes, I think that racial spatial planning is still the reality of our lives. We have not created new non-racial cities. Poverty in our country is still black and poor and feminine. So we have to understand that we haven't done the work to reverse apartheid in its material existence of apartheid. In fact, some of the greatest beneficiaries of the post-apartheid dividend have been white corporates that still dominate our economy. We have not created pathways of hope or opportunity. We have not redistributed land on the scale that allows us to deal with hunger. And we have a government today led by the party that I and President Mandela were part of that continues to strip our citizens of their rights through corruption, through its incestuous relationship with Western multinationals, in which they basically loot the public coffers through contracts that are given that don't produce results. And so, yes, we are weighed down by corruption today in South Africa. And what you see from the aeroplane at 30,000 feet when you land in Cape Town is the beauty of the geography, but the deep spatial and social inequalities that still dominate our land. And that's why we need a new revolution, a new movement, a new generation to lead us to that promised land where wealth is not dependent on where you're born, not dependent on the color of your skin, and that we don't have the stark inequality. In fact, inequality has risen in South Africa post-apartheid. We are more unequal today than we were in the past. And that's a catastrophe. And
Yeah.
that I place firmly at the door of the political party my party, that is in power today. And so, yes, we need new forms of resistance. We need new political parties. We need to liberate the political system that we put in place from the political parties who
Mm-hmm.
today control it. And so, yes,
Right.
that's part of the struggle we continue to wage, not just in South Africa, but across the world.
Mm-hmm.
What does democracy mean anywhere in the world today when
Right.
our governments are really acting at the behest of a powerful billionaire class that
Right.
controls the global economy? We are stranded. We feel alone. But for me, this is an opportunity. The crises we face, the perfect storm of an ecological crisis, the threat of war, the growing and raging inequality and poverty and hunger, presents new opportunities for a new generation to bring forward a narrative that captures our minds as a humanity that is based on values of integrity, ethics, honesty, of compassion, of reconciliation, of understanding we have to work within the planetary boundaries of Mother Earth. I think this is what the vision we have. And unfortunately, most of civil society and unions and governments have lost that vision. We now live in fear, in shame, and in guilt. And I think that's the tragedy of the time and the moment we face today in the world.
You know, I've I've just been so mesmerized by what you said, and someone who's been a fan of the Proteas team and the Springbok team and South Africa aficionado. I've also learned a lot from cultural films. Invictus showed me the juxtaposition from the Afrikaner rich white kids playing rugby and over to a rugged field where you see indigenous African boys playing football. Um, what can you say about movies that have kind of shaped South Africa's narrative? Invictus, Color of Friendship, District 9. Because sometimes soft power, but Brandon and I are a big fan of, tells a better story than parties can. Because the ANC today, you say, has lost its way. But do you think there are soft power of South Africa, the culture of South Africa, the fact that it hosts the 2010 World Cup, tells a better story of South Africa than any government can?
Absolutely true. And I would share that perspective. I think, ultimately, soft power is the only choice we have. If we're unable to talk, then we will have war. I think, Sun Tzu was a great military Chinese strategist who once said that the sweetest victory is the one you win without a shot fired. And while we need to be prepared to fight, understand that at the end of the day, we have to sit around the table and talk peace and rebuild our countries. Now, if you look at the scientific review of countries that have gone through civil war, it takes on average 25 years to get back to where you were. So I would recommend that anyone that's talks about hard power, talks about war and conflict and guns and civil conflict, I think is missing the point. At the end of the day, you have to come back and sit down and talk to your enemy. So why not talk to him before? And this is the lesson for South Africa. It's a lesson for Israel and Palestine. It's a lesson for South Sudan or DRC or the United States itself or in
Mm-hmm.
Europe. Because all these fissures are exploding now across the world, differences. We are experiencing a ferment in the world similar to what we saw in the late 60s. And I think it creates a tremendous opportunity for us to shape a new narrative, a new way of living, and one based on values. So that would be my hope and my prayer. And
Sorry, I know we went a little over time, but just on a last final note, you said that you couldn't finish your undergraduate because of political disruption, but you went to the University of Life. You've given us so many, words of wisdom. And what would be your advice for posterity, from climate change to privilege and to the 1% that we all talk about?
you know, the most important thing that binds us all as a humanity is understanding that we are here for such a short time. Mother Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Homo sapiens, us as a species, have been here for 200,000 years. But in the last 200 years, we have caused such damage to Mother Earth. Although she's had 5 successive extinctions already that happened naturally, the last one 60 million years ago when an asteroid hit our planet and took out the dinosaurs and much of life. I think today it's caused by our human greed and our stupidity. So my message is to leaders, but more importantly to young people. Let us get away from the falsehood that who I am is what I own, what car I drive, what clothes I wear, what phone I carry with me. To understand that the goal of life is actually moksha, it's liberation, it's rising to the highest level of a consciousness where I see the connection between me and everything that exists. And that would be my hope, that we find the narrative that does not put on the altar of civilization accumulation materially and wealth and power, because that will breed arrogance and that will breed all the conflicts. And we will continue repeating the cycle of conflict and anger and violence until we learn this lesson. If we want peace, we have to stop war. We have to listen to each other. We have to hear each other. We have to see each other. And we have to deal with exclusion, marginalization, the deprivation of rights of anyone. The core of democracy is my right to speak, my right to organize myself, my right to protest when I feel my rights have been threatened, and my right to form the political party of my choice. This is rights that have been taken away from us very deliberately over the last 3 years. And I'll ask young people to stand up today and insist that the fight that many generations have sacrificed so much for continues to be important elements of a democracy we want to continue with. But we want to increase the accountability, the governance, and the ethics of leadership at every level of society. And if we achieve that, we will have peace. We will not have a requirement for an arms industry. We will not have a requirement for weapons and bullets and tanks and rockets to kill each other. We will truly understand the meaning of peace and the understanding that the binding cement and glue of our humanity is actually love and compassion and solidarity.
That'll be all for this episode. If you like what you're hearing, tell a friend, or 2, or 3. And if you think we've earned it, give us a good rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. So, until we meet again on The Global Detail, look after yourselves. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. All guest views are their own. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2023 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.